Welcome back to the table, everyone. Today we're going to do a review of the Battle of Wei. This is the game that is inside issue 13 of YA Magazine. Alright, so first question that I see a lot of people post or have asked about is this just a clone of the Battle for Ramadi? No, it is not. It is, I would say, based on that engine, which is, I think, a really good engine once you kind of get it down. And we've just taken it. In fact, I think if anything, it's kind of been streamlined in a couple aspects. But I think there's some events and things that kind of make it unique to this specific battle. So Battle for Ramadi is kind of a modern day, dealing with issues, over in the Middle East. This is kind of going back to Vietnam, and so I think some of the things that he's brought in kind of reflect that very well narratively. So it's not just a clone. I think you'll find that it has some differences that make it, still a really good game to get into and try out. All right, so what do we have? Well, as far as the components, you've got your map. It's one 11 by 17 inch map, and I think the artwork on here is really good. Clearly you can see the buildings, your hexes, NVA locations are marked. You got your starting spots. It's good. You're good. Your board, and I'm just moving the camera around here, hopefully not breaking anything in the process, but here we'll talk about this operational constraints in a moment here, but this here is the play aid chart. So you got your game tracker, victory point tracker, and then over here is where you manage assets. So that's probably the first thing you'll see. I think managing your troops and assets is streamlined a little bit. It just seemed easier to manage everything, and I think that is a big improvement. Alright, now the instructions inside, I know we did like a little quick flip through. There's only a few pages of instructions. It kind of gives you a component overview, talks about the map a little bit, and gets into how to set up and play. And so it's actually, if you just kind of read through it, if you start with the setting up and just kind of follow through, it almost kind of walks you through, holding your hand a little bit, how to play. Definitely read all of the rules, because some concepts kind of overlap a little bit, but all in all it fits together pretty well. So when you're starting out, one of the biggest things is down here, I gotta move the camera, is back here where it talks about operational constraints. So one thing I enjoyed about this, I feel like the narrative was brought in very, very well. So not playing a whole lot of Vietnam era games, I don't know a whole lot about specific battles. Now the Battle of Wei, I know a little bit more about now because of this game. In addition to the game designer notes, of course, of explaining why he did what he did and some of the history. But one thing is it brought in several events. There's Task Force X-Ray, the Ankou Bridge indicator, the prison, and fire support. So a couple things that happened that I learned was Task Force X-Ray, they were trying to reach a prison where I guess ARVN, Army Regular Vietnam soldiers were held up. So they were trying to fight the NVA and send relief to the prison as well. And then at a certain point, the prison finally fell to the NVA. There's also a bridge, and apparently this bridge at some point got blown, and then it was hard to bring in reinforcements. And then there's also the prison itself, which is either in ARVN control or NVA, because once the NVA got to the prison, they released soldiers, and then they some of those released prisoners, and some of those prisoners joined with the NVA to fight against the Americans. And that narrative is in here as well and represented by special rules for that. And then fire support. So in the very beginning, the Americans weren't allowed or didn't have permission to use a lot of fire support. And then after about turn 3 of the game, you then start to get some opportunities for fire support. Oh, on turn 7 for sure, but turn 3 is where you roll and you get to, I'll show you all that here in a second. So what's really cool is you've got several events that happen in the battle that he's brought in. Now, historically, those happened at specific times in the battle. But when you start the game, what you do is, first thing is you test these constraints to see if they apply to you still or not. For example, Task Force X-Ray Urgency Indicator. when you first start the game, you're going to put this task force X-ray indicator to on, meaning that they are going to add a die roll when they're going to check to see if they attack towards the prison or not, which is this test. So on game turns 1 through 4, you roll a die 6. On a 1 through 4, no effect. 5 through 6, an attack is ordered. Add +1 to the die roll if the prison condition is currently set to Arvin held. So basically what that means is if you roll your dice, 5, and add 1, because you start the game where the prison is actually in Arvin control, what that means is the American player is going to have to launch attacks towards these indicated areas, towards the Jeanne d'Arc, Laloy Elementary School, and the post office, which are actually over here on the map, kind of near the entry point here. There's the school, Laloy Elementary, and post office. And basically it's like you're clearing those out so you can get to the prison. So that becomes a narrative objective here. I hope I explained that well, but here's why I think that was cool. Is yes, in the game this event happened, right? And that is modeled here as a thing that can happen as well. But there's a chance that it could happen sooner, or not exactly historically at the times indicated by history. The game can change that up a little bit, and I think that's fine, because I was thinking about this earlier. If the game played exactly to the historical times that events happen, then at some point there's really no need to play a game, because you already know how the battle's going to end. But by having what he's done is, let's talk about this bridge. The bridge is going to blow exactly on game turn 8. So it says move to blown at the start of game turn 8. So when you first start the game, the bridge is open, supplies can come across, it's a bridge. But on game turn 1 through 7, you're going to roll a die 6. And on 1 through 5, no effect, the bridge is open. If you roll a 6, the bridge is blown. So there's a chance that the bridge could blow early, which would affect you. It sucks, let me tell you. I've had that happen, and I'm like, man, that sucks. But the idea was the bridge, when it got blown, yeah, that did affect the Marines' ability to get reinforcements and replacements, but the battle had been so far along that it didn't affect them that badly. But if that bridge was to blow early in the battle, then yeah, it actually has a little bit of an impact, because early in the battle you've got some troops that you need to replace, because you don't have a whole lot on the board, so it delays reinforcements and replacements. So early in the game it does suck to have that bridge get blown. And then also the prison indicator at the start of turn 5, then it's captured. So you have a few turns potentially, if you follow the chart, that the prison might get captured early. So even if it doesn't happen early, there is still a historical opportunity for that event to happen when it was supposed to happen. Same with fire support. Fire support, though, the first couple turns you don't get fire support, and then on game turn 3 you start to roll to see if the fire support is available early. Otherwise it's released on turn 7. So again, it kind of follows that historical when these things became available, but there's a chance it could, as since it's a game, you might get it earlier. So I thought that was kind of cool. But that's the first thing you do, is you check these operational constraints to see if history has been changed a little bit. Now on the back here, almost everything you need to play the game is here. So that's the first thing you do, is you test your operational constraints, which instead of having the book open, I'd like that they have summarized right here the operational constraints that you're checking for. And when you start the game, they're all like the bridge is on, the prison's in Arvin control, and then fire support indicator is not available. So the first couple turns, no fire support. And then as those things change, you just move the indicator where it needs to be. Easy. Then you're going to allocate replacements. Now, when you first set up the game, that is here on page 68. So after it tells you where the beginning operational constraints are, and then it says use there's no US units on the board. So the first thing you do for game turn 1 is it tells you who's on the board. You're going to have, where is it? There was a, oh man, I just read it too. Well, there's G, where did it start? It says who I placed initially on the board. Because you get 2 tanks. Yeah. Okay, so the U.S. player has 2 ground assets available on game turn 1, the 2 tank assets. And then G, there's also A, but now I can't find it. It's like one of those things you remember reading, and then when you want to show it to somebody, you can never find it. Well, essentially you start with A. So A is like a company. It's got 3 platoons, and it's got a headquarter unit. So that would go in your assets available box. Now one other thing, and then the 2 tanks, these are my onboard assets available. My 2 tanks, the M48s, those are available. And then it also says that there was another unit here, the G25. So this here, where are they at? In my hand here. They don't necessarily, again, following the narrative, it says here, because G25 had already taken part in the probe across the bridge into the Citadel, roll 1 die 6 on a 1 through 3. This command group is operational. Otherwise, it is an operative for game turn 1 and should be placed in the unit's assets expended box. It is not eligible to be tested for operational status until game turn 2. So again, you might either start with 2 sets of folks here to go playing with, the Alpha operational group, or Golf. Let me roll. So I would just roll. Roll to 4, so that means they're not available, so I'd put them in the assets expended. So I couldn't use them this turn. So there's a chance already that, depending on how you roll, you might get something towards your advantage. Now, the first turn, there's no replacements available or anything like that, so you kind of skip that setup. Again, if you're just following the charts, so we don't get replacements, we don't get reinforcements, we don't have to test attrition recovery because there's been no combat, and then you don't have to test for the operational status because we do start with 1 ready to go, and they failed their initial game checks. They're going to sit over there for a moment. Then you get to the operations phase. Now this is the part where it's pretty similar to what you've had before. So you're going to take your group here. Now normally what I do is, for planning, is I take the operational group headquarter counter, and what I'm going to do is look at the map, and this is the part where it's very similar to like Battle for Ramadi, and where you have to do some thinking. So again, depending on how you did your task force urgency check, there's a chance that they want you to come and attack at Jeanne d'Arc, because the idea is you're trying to make a beeline as close to Jeanne d'Arc. These pink colored areas are the NVA, and they have a zone of control. So if I was trying to move somewhere, I would have to stop here because this NVA area has a zone of control. But if I was having to, go towards the prison, it said I have to attack Jeanne d'Arc, Laloy Elementary School, and the post office. So I'd pretty much have to come off the MACV compound and go straight into the heart of the city to try and get at the prison. The problem with that is you have to stop when you hit an area of control, and one of the rules is it says that when you are getting ready for assaults, that if you're next to NVA held areas, you have to assault every hex that you are adjacent to. So what does that mean? It means that if you have to go charging in to rescue the prison, that absolutely sucks, because your troops are going to get stuck in a battle with multiple hexes of enemies, and that's bad. That's a bad way to start the game. And especially because you can only have 2 ground units in a hex. So I can only bring 2 full strength platoons, and that would mean I also got to have one guy maybe off to the side, possibly assaulting a hex down here, because I can only have 2. Then you can pop your tanks in here, and having those tanks in here will help because it gives you a lot of supporting firepower. So that's the planning part. what I did is, if I don't ever have to go and attack the prison, if it says I don't have to make an attack, then what I do is I'll sometimes swing down south and find one of these lesser protected areas to come in at. That way I only have to fight one hex instead of fighting every hex that I'm adjacent to. And this is where this is different. If you've never seen this before, this is different than like a traditional hex encounter tactical game, because there's no movement points. It just says you go and you find a spot. As long as there's a line of communication open and you can move there without getting next to an NVA controlled area, you can kind of move there. That's what the operational planning is. You're deciding, okay, time to drive these assets down here and attack at the south. And that's generally where I start, because I want to try and clear my way up. So I will, like, for example, I'll move the group, I'll say here. That way I'm only fighting this one hex to start with. Because as you fight and take casualties, your strength goes down, right? So the more hexes you have to fight all at once, it's really bad for you. And then I'm going to keep a guy here on the map board for reinforcements. Because again, I can only have, 2 units in a stack. So let's say I'm going to start to attack down here. So then you say, well, how do you attack? Well, again, let's check this out real quick. U.S. operations phase, I plan my company command groups where they go, and I planned one here, and then you place your ground units, which I did. I placed my ground units here on the map. And I've got 2 here, 2 ground units there to qualify or satisfy the stacking conditions. Then you deploy your assets. Now you can have up to 3 assets in supporting you. So when you start the game, you only get 2 assets, and that's the 2 tanks. So I just deployed them both here because we're going to take that hex. Once you've deployed all your ground forces and you've got everybody set up, planned where you want to attack, then you allocate NVA. So the deployment. So again, the NVA don't start on the board. What you're going to have, and I don't have cups, but you're going to have, oh, I just dropped one. What I've got here are baggies. So you've got soldiers, events, assets. So every hex that you're going to end up fighting, you draw 1 from each bag or cup. So I'm going to have an event. Now, when you're drawing these, right, the idea is you kind of shuffle it up, you don't look. Let's see these assets. Luckily, the counters are cut in such a way that if you just kind of rub your finger on it, you can tell what's the front side and what's the back. The back side has kind of got the ridges. So if you feel that, you know that's the back side. You're just going to put those up. That way it's a surprise. And let's see what I got for a soldier. And place that face down. Now again, let's just say, for example, this is later in the game and I had another unit out here. And let's say he was adjacent to these areas. I would have to do the same thing for each of those hexes because you have to fight every hex that you're adjacent to. That's part of the planning. That's where it gets kind of, fun for you as the commander, is you're really looking there saying, okay, how can I properly deploy my limited amount of ground troops so as not to take a lot of casualties, but try and capture maybe 1 or 2, hexes, because you never know what you're going to get. So let's just say I'm just doing these 2. Let's say this group is here because there's no adjacent NVA here. So let's say I'm starting the game with my 2 full units. So I'm going to place 1 attacking group here. Now remember, they can only have 2 ground units. And let's say I'm going to put 1 supporting tank in each. So they got a tank supporting in each area. So you can resolve the combat in any order that you want. So I'm just going to start down here. And combat is pretty easy. What you do is it's basically comparing total firepower to total firepower. And wow, they drew a really nice strong unit to start out with. That's great. So what I have here is the NVA's got 4, 6, and 1. So that's 7. Plus, they get 1 defensive point because of this there's like a primary NVA spot and like just a secondary. The primary has the symbol and it's usually on a building. That gives them like 3 defensive points because they're really dug in. If there's no symbol, then that's kind of like they're out in the open, so they don't get quite as much defense, so they're weaker. So they add 1, and they add 1 die 6 die roll to their grand total. So this would be 7. It's already at 8, and then I add in a die roll of 3. So that's 11. All right, cool. You know what I should do is grab some 20-sided die. Let's see if I've got one handy. I've got all kinds of die. Well, here's a 12-sided. So they've got 11 points total. Cool. Look at that. I got all kinds of 12-sided die. Let's grab a couple 12-sided die. Oh, I found just as I find the 20. All right, so what does the American player have? So the American player starts at 9. And then we add a die 6 roll. Okay, good. So that's like what, 13, which is of course higher than my. Okay, I'm gonna have to find a handful of die 20s if I'm gonna make this work. Well, so 13. At least I think 9 plus 4 is 13. Boom. Because I got my support vehicle and the 2 attacking units. Now, you have in the book, though, just a few combat modifiers to worry about. But that's the gist. So, add the combat values of the assault and ground units, add the combat values of ground assets directly supporting the assault. And then if you have an E8 gas launcher, you get to add a die 6. Deduct 2 from the U.S. attack strength total for each enemy position hex that is adjacent to the U.S. assaulting units that is not suppressed or will not be assaulted by another U.S. ground unit, or is not already occupied by a U.S. ground unit. So basically, like if you're here and you're surrounded by hexes and you're the only assaulting unit there, that's why starting in the beginning, if you had to move forward to attack the high school, sucks because your firepower gets sucked away because they're being supported by their NVA buddies. And then you add a die 6. Well, the NVA is pretty much the same thing. You add together their attack values. Some equipment has an asterisk, so it will tell you like a special modifier. So there was an SPG-9. If the U.S. assaulting unit is directly supported by ground asset vehicle like the Ontos or the M42 or M48, their combat value is a 4 instead of a 2. So you just add and compare strength to strength. So there's an 11 for the NVA. I had a 13 total for the American forces. Now, once you've got that total, you just simply look over here on this combat chart and you look at the results. So on a difference of 1 or 2, it's a U.S. win. You can advance after combat. 1 die 6, 4 or greater is a step loss. So that means I'm going to roll a die 6. If I roll a 4 or higher, we lose 1 step. So I'm going to take my die 6. I rolled a 2. So luckily, American forces lost nothing on that. And then all this NVA stuff goes away and it goes back into the respective draw cups. That's it. And I can move forward. Now when you move forward, you can move 1 or everything. Well, since we were coming from a clear spot, I'm going to move everything up. Okay, so that's as basic as it gets. But now, where the strategy comes in, and you have to really start thinking about, is when you start advancing forward, how do you cover the rear? Normally, when you move forward, you'll place a USA control. All right, so we own that currently. But if, let's say, we were in the city, and I say beat the student center, and I moved up. Well, unfortunately, tanks can't move into these hexes. So let's say I get to Laloy, and the tanks are out here, and we're pushing forward, and I drop this. This is a problem because there are maybe unconquered NVA remaining spots. So what you got to do is leave these little control markers, and you're going to check for possible counterattack. And that's a pain because as you move forward, you have to kind of have a combination of leaving troops behind to prevent filling in from a counterattack until, and this is how I play it, once I've captured enough areas so that there's no possibility of a counterattack, then I'll just take them off and say, yeah, we own that. Because you have so much of this map to go. You do not have enough troops to leave behind one in every single hex or a control marker in every single hex to keep an open line of communication back to your main area and actually move forward and take the city. So basically, once I have guaranteed the safety of hexes, then we move forward. And that's what the Marines had to do. They didn't just capture a hex and move on. They had to secure everything around it before they progressed because they didn't want people to fill back in. And that's what you have to do here. That's where a lot of your planning comes in, is how do you manage these places that are still adjacent to NVA. So if I really was in the city and I did actually, let's say I was supporting units were here and they were supporting my assault into the Laloy Elementary, well, unless, like, if this still was NVA control, and then I would go here, I might want to leave troops here, because now the enemy can't attack in. They can't do a counterattack, because if I did move that troop forward, I could say, yeah, it's controlled by Americans for the moment, but then there's a whole section where then if you leave it like that, then you have to check to see if the NVA fill back in. And if the NVA fill back in and capture that point, then this guy is totally cut off. His line of communication is gone, and he gets wiped out. So yeah, you've got to do a lot of planning and really thinking about, it's almost like a push your luck element. Now, okay, speaking of push your luck, luckily, let's say I did push forward, and let's say I go through this whole game turn, which we'll look at how you do a game turn as it progresses. But let's say we did advance a turn. Once I go through all my operational planning and deploy troops I have available, then I can start to bring in reinforcements. So I could say, yeah, we're going to bring a unit up here. And because this is an American occupied area, you don't worry about the zone of control necessarily, because they are kind of negating the zone of control. So you just start to redeploy your troops on the map, and then it really starts to feel like a commander. You're like, yeah, okay, this company goes here, that platoon, you're going to start assaulting from here, I want you to reinforce those guys here. And that's very, very cool once you really start pushing into the city, because then you really got to start thinking about my flanks and keeping open lines of communication. Yeah, that's when the game really, really starts to sing. In the beginning, when you're just making those initial pushes into the city, it's very tough because you have very few units. But as the game progresses and you start to get a lot of support, it's, then you really feel like, okay, there's a war going on. Now, let's just talk about that, advancing the game. Basically, once your game cycle runs through for a turn, so you do your combat resolution, you resolve ground assets supporting fire. Well, that's something we didn't talk about, only because the first turn of the game there's no suppressive fire. Now later, once you have unlocked your artillery and you've got, you do airstrikes, once you unlock mortars and naval gunfire, essentially you're going to just place where you want those supporting fires to go. And luckily, that counts as an assault. So remember when I said that when you have a platoon and they're surrounded by several hexes and they have to attack every NVA controlled hex, well, once you start opening up like your naval gunfire and mortars, those suppressive attacks count for that requirement. So your platoon is being supported by all this off-board artillery, so they can focus their assault somewhere else because they've got their flanks being attacked by support. So again, in the beginning, your assaults are very, very timid, but once you start unlocking all these different support assets, boom, you can really start kind of pushing in as needed. Okay, so anyway, once you say you have planned you want to do some support, there's a real simple chart in here you look at. Basically, if it's, say, artillery, let me find it here. If it's artillery, like mortars, artillery, when it's available in the game, you're going to roll a die. It's available on a roll of 1 through 5. Basically, that's you on the radio calling it in, just to seeing if those are actually available. Because just because you have access to aircraft, those aircraft might already be on another mission. So you got to roll to see if they're available. Then if they're available, you got to roll to see if they actually suppress that target. And if they suppress that area, good news for you. If you had to, fight into that spot, for example, boom, they get a -2. So you could call in offboard artillery into a hex you want to attack, and then they get -2 on their overall strength because they've been suppressed. So use these assets. Oh, you might say, but okay, I've got assets, but how do you get them back? Well, in Battle for Ramadi, I think that was one thing I read from comments people didn't like, because there seemed to be several stages of refreshing your assets. Here, it's a lot easier. So let's say you use an asset, and I think this is the thing that will make a lot of people happy. Once you use an asset like this M48 tank, it just goes right here. Units, assets expended. Bloop. Good. Then, when you get through your turn segment, where you go to test asset attrition recovery. Well, also, when you combat, here, I'll just show you this real quick, because I didn't show you that part. Like I said, there's really a lot here. Basically, after you combat, see, we won by a +2. So the U.S. win, I got to advance after combat. We checked for step loss. Then right here, U.S. casualties, ground asset attrition. I lost 1 ground asset. So that means my tank that was supporting me, I just flip it here to the attrition side. Boom. Now, even if it didn't die, then those assets stay on the board. But if it, let's say it's dead, okay? To bring it back, all you got to do is, when you get here to the administrative phase, test for asset attrition recovery. It says right here, asset recovered on a dice roll of 1 through 4. Boom, roll your dice 6, and it's back. Well, unless you roll 6 and it's not back. So recovering assets and tracking asset usage is actually so much easier than it was before. And that's great, because again, then you're not focusing on micromanaging artillery and things like that. You just simply, oh, they're used, okay, or they're attrited, they're used up. Let's go ahead and stick them back wherever. And then we can hopefully recover them, next turn or whatever. All right, so but what do you do when a turn advances? Well, again, you've got your segment here. One thing you're going to do when it comes to the reinforcement schedule, when you're checking for that, it tells you, oh yeah, so this is where the A. On turn 1, you start with Alpha Company, and it gives you 3 platoons plus a command group. You also get Golf Company, which is 3 platoons plus a command group. It's just that there's that special rule where you roll a dice 6 to see if Golf is actually available that beginning turn. And then there's my 2 tank assets. And my replacements are none. No replacements on the first couple of turns. No checkpoint or variable point length. So the game goes for 12 turns, but if you want, there's an optional rule to potentially play the game for a few more turns if you want. And then it will also tell you, again, as you play, the assets that become available. So even on turn 2, you're going to have access to, well, turn 3, you can get a mortar and an army artillery. But they're available. But that doesn't mean you can use them, because, again, one of the things you have to do is check your operational constraint to see if the fire support becomes available. So at the start of game turn 3, you get to roll a die 6. On a 1 through 4, the artillery is not available. On a turn 5 through 6, artillery is available. Boop. So you just make that check. But once you hit game turn 7, even if all these were failed before, game turn 7, boom, you automatically go to available and you have fire support. So again, like I said, this kind of supports narratively the idea that certain things weren't available to you at the start of the game, but historically they became available later during the battle. This just gives you an opportunity to possibly change history a little bit and pull some of those assets in sooner. That way you're not exactly repeating history, otherwise you don't need a game for that. You just know that America won, essentially that. But this gives you a chance to kind of change things up a little bit. Well, that covers most of it. I know that that was just kind of throwing a lot of information at you, but I hope that gives you kind of an idea of some of the things to look forward to when you play. some of the counters that you have, kind of my thoughts on the goals of the game to get victory points. Well, that's probably the last thing to talk about. How do you win? Well, get through 12 turns and calculate up your victory points. So they have here on page 67, you gain your victory points. Here it talks about gaining and losing victory points, and there's a tracker right here, and it's all summarized here. So essentially, as you say capture secondary NVA spots or primary, you're going to move up the tracker. It also has victory point for each U.S. assault win where the NVA asset is either a cadre or counterattack. So there are a couple of certain attack types that you encounter you'll get an extra victory point for. +1 victory point for each NVA event with a positive U.S. outcome. And I thought that was one thing that was kind of cool too. Again, pulling in that historical narrative on the events. There is an event that I encountered, one that sticks out to me the most here is the media. So this is when you're setting up your attack stack for the NVA. One of these is a media event. So what you do is, this adds nothing to the immediate combat, so you're probably going to win that battle. But what you do then afterwards is you roll a die 6. If you roll a 1, it says, good news, friendly foreign journalist recovered. That gives you a victory point. Boom. There's a victory point for me. I recovered a journalist. If I roll a 2 or 3, it says, it's not looking good. The communists may not be winning the war, but they don't seem to be losing it either. And that's a quote from Robert Goralski, NBC, and there's no effect on victory points. And then if you roll a 4 through 6, we're losing. What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war. Walter Cronkite from CBS, -1 victory point. So there's little narrative things built into some of these events that can either have direct outcome on the battle or is going to have maybe an effect later that could affect things like civilians. There was some 20,000 civilians caught up in the fighting in the triangle. This is the triangle. You roll die 6. You either recover some refugees or there were some casualties incurred and you lose a victory point. If the target hex subject to U.S. supporting fires or of any type, add 1 to the die roll. So if this happened in a hex that you were dropping your artillery on, it's possibly that you're going to have more casualties. So there's just a lot of little subtle things that I think really, one, adds some flavor to the game, brings in that narrative to the historical battle that was fought, and you also are planning out a lot of battles. So again, it's not tactical level. You're not worried about movement points, line of sight, things like that. You're really focused on where are you deploying your troops so that they can be best used to capture as many areas to get as many victory points as you possibly can. And I'll tell you, it's not easy. I don't think I've gotten a really good result yet. So like if we're looking at victory points, it says, oh, where is it? If you get less than 49 victory points, the NVA has successfully resisted U.S. attempts to retake the triangle and gained a propaganda victory. So you got to get at least 50 victory points to get a marginally successful operation. So anything less than 50 and it's basically a loss. 90 points or more is a historical victory. Well done. Your performance has matched that of Task Force X-Ray and the triangle is clear. Let's just say I'm hovering in the upper 40s to low 50s. It's not a good experience for me. So luck of the dice roll, poor planning, whatever you want to call it. But I think overall this is a pretty good game to get into, just to, it's a solo, doesn't take up much table space. Overall though, if you're interested in Vietnam-based solitaire planning, kind of at an operational level and not necessarily down at the tactical level, I don't think you can go wrong with this. Once you kind of understand the importance of maintaining, here, let's move it back to the board. Once you kind of get a feel for, leaving the control markers and clearing out adjacent enemy areas before you really start advancing forward, kind of once you get a rhythm for the game, then it really starts to play really well. I think I've covered just about everything I could really want to talk about for this game. The only thing I didn't cover was how you actually do replacements, which is on the board, so I'll just show that to you real quick. I think that'd be like the last thing. Whoops, you didn't hear that. Okay, so basically, once you have available replacements, you just roll a die 6 as -3, and if you get one, like if you subtract 3 from the result. So if your total would be less than 0, you always get at least 1 replacement point. Plus, then on your little reinforcement tracker, which is right here, it's going to tell you if you get any replacement or reinforcement points along with your die roll. So if you had none but just a die roll and I only got 1, that means I could bring a wounded unit. Basically, I can just bring something back to 1 step. Or if something was completely destroyed, you know, you just bring it back to 1 step and then potentially get to bring it back. And that's about it. I think that covers everything about the game. So I know that was a lot to take in, so I appreciate if you watched that. Hopefully this answers questions that you had about the game. So if there are any questions that I didn't cover very well for you, please put them in the comments. If you've played this or if you have thoughts on it, please share as well. Let me know what you think. And